Our first keynote presentation, George Hosking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to come back to God's country. You may detect from my accent that I did start my life in this part of the world, so it's always a pleasure to be back here. And very interesting to be part of this conference in conflict, because I've spent the last 20 years of my life looking at issues of conflict, violence and struggle, including, just to touch on something that Mary said, being trained as a facilitator in the Alternatives to Violence program. So, which was extremely valuable, because I found that before I could actually start to deal with the issue of violence in other people, I first had to deal with the violence inside myself. And it was the AVP program which actually enabled me to understand and come to terms with that. So I think knowing oneself is always a good step on the path to knowing others. So I'm going to talk about the early years and how they shape future human relationships. And basically, the reason that I speak about this is that 20 years ago, I set up a charity called WAVE Trust. And WAVE actually stands for Worldwide Alternatives to Violence. We stole a little bit of our title from the Alternatives to Violence program. I'd come from a career previously spent entirely in industry, traveling around the world for a large multinational corporation or for an international strategy consultancy, looking at how to make international companies successful in their strategies. And I was reasonably good at that. And I had the commitment, grew out of being horrified by some terrible cases of child abuse that I came across, to apply my training in business strategy to the challenge of reducing violence and child abuse in the world. And when I set up the charity, we spent more or less 9 years doing almost nothing but research. And at the end of that research, at the end of that 9 years, we actually thought that we did understand something about the causes of violence, what it is that makes people become violent. We identified two elements that are critical in the creation of violence in people's behavior. One is an internal personal factor, which we call the propensity to be violent, and the other are the external factors which trigger violent behavior. And there are many external factors. I could list at least 50. But among the things that impact it are alcohol consumption, viewing violent videos or media, and the fact that children these days are spending a great deal longer in between the onset of puberty and beginning work, during which period a lot of testosterone-type energy can find its way into teenage violence. And probably most of you in this room know that the peak period for violence in our society is during the teenage years. But the most interesting thing in our studies was that we found that people are almost never violent if they don't have the inner propensity to be violent. So the triggers, like alcohol consumption, I mean, there's a possibility that some people in this room have been drunk at some stage in their life. You don't need to put your hands up. But it's very unlikely that on becoming violent, on becoming drunk, you became violent. Most people don't. If they did, our pubs and clubs would be full of violence every night of the year. Actually, it's quite rare. But when a person with a propensity to be violent gets drunk, they can be lethally dangerous. It's the same with violent media. You may watch violent media. What else is there to watch on television these days? But it doesn't make you go out and start being violent to your neighbours. But children who grew up in a violent household who watch violent media are more likely to go out and perpetrate violence because they've got that inner propensity. And where does it come from? Essentially, it comes from early life experience, which is normally inside the family. And international study after international study has identified some aspect of parenting style as being responsible for developing the inner propensity to be violent inside our children. And while all of these overlap with each other and have an impact, the one I've picked out in blue is the one that we find to be the single greatest creator of violent personalities, which is parents who use harsh parental discipline. But what came as a great surprise to us during our 9-year study was the extent to which violence is implanted in children in the earliest years of their life. And we first discovered this through a study carried out in New Zealand, in the city of Dunedin in the South Island of New Zealand. Every child born in Dunedin in the year 1972, that's about 1,000 children, has been followed throughout their life ever since. When the children were aged 3, nurses watched them at play. The nurses knew nothing about the children, nothing about their backgrounds, their families, or anything. But just by watching them at play for 90 minutes, the nurses divided them into 2 groups, a normal group and an at-risk group. When comparisons were made 18 years later of these 2 groups, the males who'd been identified as at risk, 2.5 times as many had 2 or more criminal convictions as in the normal group. 55% of their offences were violent, compared with only 18% in the normal group. And if you looked at domestic violence for 21-year-old males who had a relationship, in the normal group, 9.5% were domestic violence perpetrators, 9.5% too many. But in the at-risk group, nearly half, 5 times as many, 47%, were domestic violence perpetrators. And nurses could pick that out 18 years in advance by watching 3-year-old children at play. It's the same if you look at the females. Fewer females became conduct disordered. But if you looked at those that were, in the at-risk group, 30% had become teenage mothers. In the normal group, not one had become a teenage mother. And of those teenage mothers, nearly half were in violent, abusive relationships. And as the researchers said, already by 1993, immature mothers with no strong parenting skills and violent partners had already borne the next generation of at-risk children, what's often called the cycle of violence. This is information produced by Professor Richard Tremblay from the University of Montreal. Richard Tremblay looked at violent teenagers, and he studied the pathways to becoming violent teenagers. And he found that you could actually pick out the cohort of children from whom those violent teenagers would emerge before they were 5 years old. In fact, he found that the top line here, which is that 1 in 6 children who are the most aggressive at age 2 to 3, were 10 times more aggressive than the 1/3 of children who were the most peaceful at age 2 to 3. Just imagine, 10 times more aggressive at age 2 to 3. And those are the children that are going to be the aggressive teenagers of the future. What has made these children have such high levels of aggression at such an early age? Any guess? It's what's happened with their parents. It's what they see at home. It's what they've experienced. Children are like sponges. The infant brain is expanding at an incredible rate. When children are born, they have 10 trillion synapses, that's connections, inside their brain. In the next 3 years, that will have multiplied 20-fold to 200 synapses, to 200 trillion synapses. That is not specified by genes. It's too many. It's mathematically impossible for genes to control that. It's controlled by the experiences the children go through in that first 3 years. And those experiences shape the brains. And by the way, if that sounds like a large increase in synapses, just do the arithmetic. I've done it many times. What it means, and just think this next time you look at a baby, every second of that baby's life for 3 years, it's adding new connections at the rate of more than 1 million per second. Just think. 1 million new synapses, 1 million new synapses, 1 million. So everything that child is experiencing is being converted into the architecture of its brain. Now, I don't mean in a way that it can't be changed afterwards. It can be changed afterwards. But it becomes progressively more fixed as the child gets older. And if it's growing up in the wrong environment, then that becomes the way the child relates to and experiences the world. The emotional brain of a child is largely created in that first 18 months. And when children are abused or neglected during that period, it severely impacts their brains. This is a picture of 2 3-year-old children and their brains. They are to scale. The one on the left is a normal child. The one on the right is one which has suffered extreme neglect. Not only is its brain much smaller, but it has quite a number of dark patches inside it where the brain has just completely failed to develop. So what is it that's shaping things in this period? It's the interaction with the parent. Alan Shore is a psychiatrist from California who has an eidetic memory. Every single thing he ever reads, he remembers word perfect forever afterwards. I wish I'd had that when I was at school in Glasgow. He was asked one day by a man called Richard Bowlby, son of John Bowlby, some of you will have heard of. Richard Bowlby asked Alan Shore, if you had to summarize everything you have learned in 10 years that Alan had spent immersing himself in thousands of scientific papers in neurobiology, psychology, and infant development, in one sentence, what would the sentence be? And Alan's answer was, the child's first relationship, the one with the mother, it's usually the mother, it can be the father if that's the prime carer, acts as a template which permanently molds the individual's capacity to enter into all later emotional relationships. The infant brain needs time to mature, and while it's doing it, the baby has to learn what the world is, and it learns about the world through the interaction with the parent, through eye gaze, facial expressions, non-verbal signals. And I want to show you an example of this. It's a 10-minute-old baby interacting with its father.
Xavier, hello, hello.
Only 10 minutes old, Xavier's infant senses are bombarded with new sights, sounds, and feelings.
Good boy.
He watches his father pull faces and then slowly responds. This isn't conscious mimicry. Xavier doesn't even know he has a face. But he's managing to translate what he sees into similar actions of his own.
Hello. You copy Daddy.
Imitation is one of the best learning strategies babies have. It teaches them what it feels like to be human.
Now that's great if learning to be human is learning to be caring, loving, empathic, sensitive. But for some children, what they're learning is conflict, aggression, fighting, anger, shouting, hitting. And if that's what they are learning, because they're a sponge which is creating a model of the universe based on that experience, that's what they learn, the same way that little baby learned to stick out its tongue at 10 minutes old. By the way, I tried that with my 6-month-old grandson here in Glasgow, and it worked. My daughter-in-law wasn't wildly pleased for some reason. I'm now going to show you another video, if we can get this one to work. This is a slightly older child interacting with the mother. And I want you to again see how critical the nature of that early interaction between, how that reaction between mother and parent.
Just how crucial the first year is to a child's future development is emerging here at Dundee University.
So what we're going to do is get you just to interact with Fraser, just as you normally would with him sitting here and kind of smile and talk and things like that. And then
Dr. Suzanne Zedijk has spent the past 6 years trying to understand what babies need for healthy development. The latest research shows that it's the quality of interaction between a child and a carer that's crucial, particularly during the first year.
Okay? Hey, all right. Oh. Look, you see, we've got this looking conversation going on. Baby's looking at mom's face, eye gaze is really tight, smiling, really intense kind of looking here. Okay, so we've got a conversation going on. Hi, is that good? What the baby is getting from this kind of interaction is it's learning that that what it's doing has an impact on what other people are doing, so that when it looks at mom, mom looks back at it. That's the sort of thing that, although it looks very, very subtle, it doesn't look like a lot, it's these kinds of things that are crucial to interaction at this age.
To show how a child's sense of well-being is dependent upon the quality of interaction, Dr. Zedijk has asked this mother to stop responding to her baby. The child's reaction demonstrates what happens if it does not receive this kind of stimulation.
So here, mom's face is now being held still. She's not responding to what the baby's doing. And you can start to see the discomfort of the baby. See how it looks away? It now looks really withdrawn and kind of despondent. It checks back with mom. She doesn't smile. It tries. It even tries a smile. She doesn't respond. Its smile goes away. The baby's looking down. It's not even trying to interact. If this goes on and on and on over a long term, you're going to get a withdrawn child who doesn't understand that other people will interact with it. And if it doesn't understand that other people interact with it, you don't have a healthy person.
What we see there is the process which we call attunement. You saw the early, very good attunement being in harmony between the mother and the baby, and then you saw what happens when there isn't that attunement. Studies have shown that that attunement is critical in creating empathy. Drew mentioned empathy as something that is of fundamental importance. And our research shows that empathy is the single greatest antidote to violent behaviour. If I asked each of you to hit your neighbour as hard as you can and keep doing so, most of you would stop after the first time you hit them. Some of you might not even start. And the reason is because actually you would feel the pain of your neighbour. And that pain is the empathy. But I know from working, I'm a criminologist, from working in prisons with violent offenders, that they just don't have that. They describe what they do to people as if what they were working on was a piece of wood, not a human being with feelings that they're able to relate to. Lack of attunement between mother and baby. This is a study at the University of Pittsburgh by Professor Daniel Shaw. Had these consequences in the behaviour of children as they grew through to age 6. Absence of empathy is typical of violent criminals. How often have you heard of horrendous court cases in which the judge said the accused showed no emotion, the accused showed no remorse? I couldn't count the thousands of times that I've heard that. It's because these people do not have empathy. And you don't have empathy when you haven't experienced being on the receiving end of it yourself as a child. These are 2 reports by WAVE, which have got some suggestions in them. I'm not going to have time to go through it in any detail, about things that can be done to improve the quality of early life experience for children. One is called Conception to Age 2, the Age of Opportunity, and the other is called Building Great Britons. They're both on the WAVE Trust website. I'll show you that before the end. The Conception to Age 2 study, which was an 18-month study carried out in partnership with the Department for Education in England, came out with a set of fundamental recommendations, and I'll jump simply to the recommendations for action. These are the 10 key recommendations for action that underlay that 18-month study with the Department for Education. We have a particular focus in WAVE on number 4, achieving a major reduction in abuse and neglect, because we have found that child abuse and neglect underlie a huge raft of the problems that exist in society. They underlie a high proportion of mental health problems. They lead to poor physical health. they lead to poor educational performance, and they lead to high levels of aggression, poor relationship skills, high levels of conflict in people's lives subsequently. We've actually created a campaign, which we call the 70-30 campaign, to reduce child maltreatment in the UK by 70% by the year 2030. We call that 70-30. And among the people who's supporting that is Professor Sir Harry Burns, whom some of you in this room will have heard of or know. And this is what Harry has to say. It's not wishful thinking. It's not an unachievable goal. It's actually the minimum that's acceptable to achieve it. How will we achieve it? Well, I'm going to ask in a moment for help from people in this room. We've been speaking to politicians for some years about this, and we've got many quite major politicians in all three major parties in the UK to support the 70-30 goal. People like the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, Andy Burnham, former Labour Health Minister, Michael Gove, the former Education Minister. But what they tell us is they can't get their fellow politicians to treat child abuse as an important enough issue to get them to change policy. See, the answer to child abuse is actually very simple. How we tackle child abuse in this country and neglect is we wait until after it happens. And then we, in some cases, about 1 case in 10, we intervene after the event when the damage is done. The solution is really, really simple. Don't wait till it happens. Get in before it happens. Support the family to deal with the issues which are likely to make it happen, among which family conflict is one of the issues, and then help the family to deal with that. Prevention rather than cure. It can make the difference between children whose faces look like this for the rest of their lives and children whose faces look like that for the rest of their lives. We've set up a campaign in which we're inviting people from around the UK to become ambassadors whose basic job is to become educated in the research around why stopping child abuse and neglect is the best thing we can do, not only for children, but actually for the public purse, because it saves money, because it's more effective financially. John Carnochan has been saying this for years, to save money through prevention, rather than to wait and spend all the money at the bottom of the cliff after the children have fallen over. And then we educate them with the information to go and work with their MSPs, their MPs, their local councillors. My colleague Anthula, who's here in the red cardigan at the front, Anthula, will you wave your hand up, is leading that project. And in a year, we've created 70 ambassadors around the UK. And we've already got 12 MPs who've signed up to become backers of the 70-30 campaign. We want this year to get to more than 200 ambassadors. And if anyone in this room is interested in joining that movement and becoming an ambassador for WAVE, please speak to Anthula or email the person who's there. Thank you very much.